Jamaica's long march to nationhood began with the fight for freedom from plantation slavery. Nanny of the Maroons and Sam Sharp were the two greatest leaders of that fight. The next stage was the struggle of the newly freed people for land and social justice, which was led by George William Gordon and Paul Bogle. Marcus Garvey dedicated his life to the liberation of Africans at home and abroad from racial oppression and to the organization of people of African descent for economic and political power. Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley were the founding fathers of modern Jamaica, who secured fundamental rights for the Jamaican people and completed the march to independence.
A people without the knowledge of their past, history, culture, and origin is like a tree without roots.
Marcus, Mosiah, Garvey, Marcus, Mosiah, Garvey, Marcus, Mosiah, Garvey, man of nobility, man of nobility. He said, up, the mighty race, one God, one aim, one destiny. Africa for Africans, at home and abroad. We must.
The black skin is not a badge of shame, but a symbol of national greatness.
It's not an easy road. How many see the glamour and the glitter, so them think I better rose. Me say, who feels it knows.
We often think that larger-than-life personalities, like our first national hero, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, was born to wealth and privilege. The truth is that for Marcus, survival often came down to the sheer will and strength of character. His early life was very much like that of today's youth at risk, struggling desperately to survive and in need of motivation, opportunity, and resources to succeed. Imagine growing up without piped water, sewage, electricity, radio, or television, and having no access to public health services while faced with malnutrition as well as life-threatening diseases such as hookworm, tuberculosis, yaws, and malaria. This was the experience of the Garvey family, as 9 of the 11 Garvey children died in infancy. Growing up in St. Ann's Bay, Garvey knew the pain of poverty and hardship. His father was a stern disciplinarian who, on one occasion, locked Marcus in an unfinished grave, thinking it would make him conquer fear. Imagine where you would be today if, like Marcus Garvey, you had to drop out of school at 11 years to help support your family, instead of going on to age 15 to complete elementary school. Could you have coped if, like Marcus at age 15, you had to fend for your mother and sister after your father abandoned the family? The struggle to survive was real.
Marcus Garvey grew up in a time when racial discrimination was accepted as the norm in Jamaica, and he was not yet in his teens when he learned firsthand what it meant to be black in a society dominated by the white and fair-skinned people who also owned the wealth of the country. As a boy, he attended the Methodist Church in St. Ann's Bay and made friends with the daughter of the white Methodist minister. As they grew older, the girl's father told her not to continue the friendship with Marcus because he was a nigger. The disadvantages of being poor and black did not stop Marcus from seizing every opportunity to move ahead. Although poor, his father was a keen reader of books and kept a small library at home. Marcus took the opportunity to read his father's books and over time became an avid reader himself. By age 15, Marcus, the sole breadwinner for his family, the thinker, the dreamer, the voracious reader, was on his way to becoming Marcus the visionary, the fighter for equal rights and justice for black people, and the organizer of black people worldwide for economic empowerment and to emancipate themselves from mental slavery. However, with all of his determination, Garvey may not have succeeded in his life's work without the mentorship and support he received from Jack Cap Burroughs, who owned a printery and was a man of means and influence in St. Ann's Bay. Burroughs took on Garvey as an apprentice, and Garvey in turn applied himself diligently to the task, mastering the art of printing by age 19. This skill gave him the knowledge he needed to go out on his own. At age 19, he made his way to Kingston, determined to make a life in the capital city. For Garvey, it was not an easy road from St. Ann's Bay to Kingston.
Keeping hope alive in the capital city. Garvey arrived in Kingston from St. Ann in 1906 and was able to secure modest accommodation with a family friend, Thaddeus McCormick, at 13 Pink Lane in the ghetto of West Kingston. On January 14, 1907, Kingston was destroyed by a massive earthquake. Marcus Garvey escaped injury, but all around him was death and destruction. He landed a job in the printing department of P.A. Benjamin Manufacturing Company, and with a steady income was able to bring his mother and sister to share his tiny accommodation at Pink Lane. His mother, overwhelmed by the harshness of ghetto life, died soon thereafter, while his sister, Indiana, found work as a domestic. A lesser man might have given up, but Garvey pressed on. His determination and indomitable pioneering spirit helped him to keep hope alive. Convinced that education gave you the power to be the master of your own destiny, he never stopped learning and always carried a pocket dictionary with him to learn new words.
At age 21, Garvey became the foreman at Benjamin's printery, a job normally reserved for whites. When the workers protested against the working conditions, Garvey led them in a strike at the printery. It was a huge risk that very few supervisors would have taken on behalf of workers, and Garvey paid the price. He was fired. Undaunted, he pressed on. By then, Garvey had come under the influence of Joseph Robert Love, who published The Advocate, a newspaper which Garvey said stirred his racial consciousness. He then joined the National Club, Jamaica's first nationalist organization, which was led by a white lawyer, Sandy Cox. Garvey and Wilfred Domingo were the assistant secretaries of the club, and both of them jointly published the club's weekly pamphlet, The Struggling Mass. Unfortunately, the National Club did not survive the unbearable pressure brought on the leadership by the establishment, and after 3 years, the club closed its doors and the leader, Sandy Cox, migrated to the United States. Garvey next started his own newspaper, The Watchman, dedicated to the advancement of the black man. The newspaper taught that the black man could only progress by knowledge of self. Knowing who you are and where you are coming from was the key to discovering your worth and realizing your potential. Self-knowledge, bolstered by the confidence that the Negro race was the equal of all other races, was the basis for racial pride and the respect of other races. However, unable to secure adequate financial support, the newspaper folded after a few months.
Up, you mighty race! You can accomplish what you will.
The making of a Pan-African leader and the founding of the UNIA. Garvey's story shows the importance of working hard to achieve your goals and never giving up no matter what your circumstances in life. Unable to make a steady living in Kingston, Garvey, like thousands of other Jamaicans, left Jamaica in search of opportunities elsewhere. In 1911, Garvey left Jamaica for Costa Rica, where he worked on a banana plantation. While there, he launched a local newspaper to advocate for better working conditions for the migrant community and to spread his message of racial pride. After Costa Rica, he moved on to Panama and Ecuador, where he continued his campaign on behalf of the black migrant workers for equal rights and justice. But it was a 2-year stint in England that would finally prepare him for what would become his life's work: the liberation and economic empowerment for Africans and people of African descent the world over. During his sojourn in London, he began writing for a Pan-African journal, took up public speaking, and honed his debating skills.
Will I not go to hell a million times for you? If I die in Atlanta, my work will only just then begin.
Marcus Garvey was now a Pan-African leader in the making. Hard times in cosmopolitan London forced Garvey to move back to Jamaica. He returned with a vision of a united Africa and an organization that would unite Africans at home and abroad in a mighty empire. On July 20, 1914, just 5 days after his return to Jamaica, Garvey convened a meeting which was attended by 17 persons. And it was this meeting that launched the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities Imperial League. The name was later shortened to the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. Garvey was elected president and traveling commissioner, and Amy Ashwood, a 17-year-old girl just out of high school, was elected secretary. Garvey's sister, Indiana, was one of the 15 members of the Board of Management. The aim of the UNIA was to establish a brotherhood among the black race, to promote a spirit of race pride, to reclaim the fallen, and to assist in civilizing the backward tribes of Africa. And the organization had its own flag of red, black, and green.
Garvey now set about to build the UNIA island-wide, and one of the first meetings he scheduled was for his hometown of St. Ann's Bay, to impress family and friends that he had made a success and to raise funds for his organization. He hired a car for the occasion, which unfortunately broke down in Spanish Town, and by the time he and Amy Ashwood arrived in St. Ann's Bay, most of the crowd had dispersed. The meeting was far from successful, and he did not raise a single penny to pay the cost of hiring the car. It was another setback for Garvey. Back in Kingston, Garvey, in his three-piece suit and tie, as he addressed countless meetings, worked hard to build the UNIA. But despite his efforts, the UNIA did not achieve the success he had hoped for. The reality was that Garvey, a black man without wealth and status, had the odds stacked against him becoming a successful leader in the Jamaica of that period. After 18 months, the UNIA's membership was less than 100. It was at this stage that Garvey, having learnt of Tuskegee College in Alabama, USA, which had been founded by the American Negro Booker T. Washington to provide skills training for black youths, decided to visit Tuskegee College in order to seek assistance to establish a similar training institution in Jamaica. Unfortunately, Booker T. Washington died in 1915, a year before Garvey disembarked at the port of New York in March 1916. It was during his 3-year stay in New York that Marcus Garvey would achieve one of the organizational miracles of the 20th century by making the UNIA the largest and most powerful Pan-African organization that the world had ever known.
Up, you mighty race! You can accomplish what you will.
After disembarking in New York, Garvey headed straight to Harlem, where African Americans and African West Indian migrants, like himself, had made their home. Little did he know that New York would be just as challenging as Jamaica. He rented a room and rationed his meager savings, hoping to earn a living as a public lecturer. 1 month after his arrival, he rented St. Mark's Hall for his first public lecture. Neither the chairman nor his substitute turned up, and only 36 people were present when Garvey mounted the podium. Before he could begin his lecture, he experienced a dizzy spell, swayed, and fell to the floor. Undaunted, Garvey planned a tour of the United States and finally met with Robert Moulton, who had succeeded Booker T. Washington as the president of Tuskegee College. Again, Garvey was disappointed when the assistance he had expected from Moulton to start a college like Tuskegee in Jamaica was not forthcoming, and all he got were words of encouragement. He then booked St. Mark's Hall again for his second public lecture, to which he invited the former President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, and charged $1 for admission. The second lecture was hardly more successful than the first.
Finally, Garvey got an opportunity to be heard when the well-known civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph offered him his soapbox to address a crowd on the streets of Harlem. That evening, Garvey's tremendous voice could be heard for 10 blocks. He was a tremendous success. The tide had finally turned. He took another step forward when on June 12, 1917, Hubert Harrison, Harlem's most influential intellectual, invited Garvey to share the platform at the inaugural meeting of his newly formed Liberty League of Negro Americans. 2,000 people were in attendance, and when Garvey took the floor, his magnetic personality, eloquence, and crowd psychology swept the audience. Overnight, he became a sensation. For the next 3 years, Garvey was single-minded in devoting his time and energy to building the UNIA as a worldwide organization for the liberation and empowerment of Africans at home and in the diaspora. In 1918, Garvey began the publication of The Negro World, with the masthead of the paper carrying the UNIA's motto, "One Aim, One God, One Destiny." In the first year, the paper achieved a global circulation of 3 million. While it was banned by British colonials, Garvey's teachings in the Negro World inspired African nationalist leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, the first presidents of independent Ghana and Kenya respectively. The following year, 1919, Garvey established the Black Star Line Steamshipping Corporation, and thousands of UNIA members who had purchased shares in the company witnessed the launch of the first ship acquired by the company, the SS Yarmouth. The UNIA also established a range of business enterprises to provide an economic base for its membership. That same year, Garvey also established Liberty Hall in Harlem as the headquarters of the UNIA.
During this period, Marcus Garvey reunited with Amy Ashwood, and the couple were married at Liberty Hall with 3,500 guests witnessing the occasion. However, the marriage lasted for only 3 months, and Garvey chose Amy Jakes, a Jamaican, as his second wife, who devoted herself entirely to her family and the UNIA. She became a cornerstone for the movement, and her unfailing diligence, loyalty, and capacity for work proved critical in Marcus Garvey's climb to the top. August 1, 1920, marked the opening of the month-long International Convention of Negro Peoples of the World. By this time, the membership of the UNIA was 3 million strong, with 55 UNIA branches spread across the USA, the Caribbean, and Central America. The convention opened with a parade of some 20,000 members, with representatives from various black-led groups, including the Universal African Legion. New York was spellbound. Garvey himself was resplendent in his robes and plumed helmet, and Madison Square Gardens overflowed with an audience swelling with pride and emotion to hear the great man speak.
Trial and tribulation. However, as Garvey's power and his influence increased, he attracted the enmity of those who were jealous of his success, as well as the powerful United States government, who saw him as a dangerous black man with far too much power and a notorious Negro agitator. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, led the campaign to get rid of Garvey. W.E.B. Du Bois, co-founder and president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was jealous of Garvey's success as were the leaders of the other Negro organizations who came together to launch the Garvey Must Go campaign in January 1923. They went as far as to seek the assistance of the U.S. Attorney General to disband and extirpate this vicious movement. Even Garvey's former Jamaican colleague Wilfred Domingo also joined in the attack. Unfortunately, the UNIA had been weakened by the failure of the steamship line and other commercial ventures to become profitable businesses. Garvey, without business experience, had been duped by unscrupulous advisors in the setting up of the Black Star Line, and its operations were undermined by corrupt employees. In 1924, the witch hunt had its victory when Garvey and 2 other Black Star Line officials were accused of mail fraud. Garvey's real crime was his audacity to believe that blacks could have power in a world dominated by whites. While no definitive proof was ever offered to implicate him, Garvey was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served 3 months before he was granted bail, and during those 3 months, Garvey's supporters, in a show of great confidence in their leader and his goals, secured funding for the purchase of yet another ship to launch a new shipping line, the Black Cross Navigation and Trading Company. Garvey eventually lost his appeal in February 1925 and began serving time. Over the next 2 years, there was an overwhelming outpouring of support by way of letters, petitions, militant speeches, and demonstrations calling for Garvey's release. Finally, in November 1927, President Calvin Coolidge commuted Garvey's sentence, and he was taken to the port of New Orleans for deportation to Jamaica. Thousands of his supporters gathered to see him off as his ship set sail.
Back on the Rock. Marcus Garvey returned to Jamaica on December 10, 1927, to the most enthusiastic welcome. There was a surging mass, deafening cheers were raised, and the cheering was intense as the motorcade, followed by a massive crowd, took him through the streets of Kingston. The mayor of Kingston held an official reception on his behalf at the Ward Theatre the following night, where it was reported that the crowd spilled out onto the streets. A re-energized Garvey re-established the local chapter of the UNIA and led the organization on a 6-week island-wide recruitment and refamiliarization tour. For the 6th staging of the UNIA convention, held at Edelweiss Park in Kingston on August 1, 1929, hundreds of delegates came from UNIA branches worldwide, and an estimated crowd of 25,000 took part in the 5-mile parade as some 90,000 lined the streets along the designated route. You can imagine how inspiring it must have been for all who witnessed this outpouring of black pride and achievement, led by a man who, against all odds, had kept his vision alive and climbed to the top of the Pan-African world.
Garvey next launched the People's Political Party on September 9, 1929, at a public meeting in Crossroads in Kingston. It was Jamaica's first modern political party. His mission, he declared, was to see Jamaica prosperous and all the people happy, and his 14-plank platform included a minimum wage, land reform, and the establishment of a Jamaican university and polytechnic. 2 months later, Garvey announced himself as a candidate to contest the by-election for a seat in the Kingston and St. Andrew Corporation. However, before the election was held, Garvey was arrested and sent to prison for 3 months for demeaning the judiciary and undermining public confidence in them. His manifesto had included passing a law to impeach and imprison judges who illicitly enter into agreements to deprive other subjects of their rights. He was serving his 3-month sentence in jail when he won the by-election, but the court ruled that he had failed to obtain leave of absence from his political duties and declared his seat vacant. Once again, Garvey would experience the kind of setback and disappointment that would make lesser men give up. Garvey pressed on and contested a seat in the 1930 Legislative Council elections. he was defeated by George Seymour Seymour, a white landowner. A disappointed Garvey initially blamed his supporters for taking bribes to vote for his opponent, but later recognized that his loss was due to the fact that the thousands of people who cheered him at his meetings did not yet have the vote. Despite yet another setback, Garvey continued on his mission and launched the Jamaica Workers and Laborers Association in April 1930. While building his political organization, Garvey also made a major contribution to Jamaican popular culture with the establishment of the Edelweiss Park Amusement Company in 1931, which offered a venue for the black community to express themselves in music, drama, and elocution.
Exile and Death. Garvey's activities were a severe drain on his limited financial resources. Unable to obtain credit, and with his debt mounting, the UNIA's headquarters, Edelweiss Park, was sold by public auction in 1934. The printery was next to go, followed by his furniture. In desperation, he chose exile, got a loan from a friend, and booked his passage to England, leaving his wife and children in Jamaica. He would later confide to a friend,
"I left Jamaica broken in spirit, broken in health, and broken in pocket."
Such was Garvey's feeling of rejection, deep disappointment, and demoralization. Garvey relocated the UNIA headquarters to London and tried for a while to rebuild the organization. But by then, he was a mere shadow of the man he used to be. Ill health and financial difficulties had worn him down. In 1940, Marcus suffered a stroke, and one of his adversaries sent out a press release that he had died. Later, while reading his own obituary in the press, as well as unkind comments about his life and work, Garvey collapsed and died on June 10, 1940, at the age of 52.
For years after Marcus Garvey's death, there was little or no discussion about his life and work. His wife, Amy Jakes, kept his name alive by publishing his works and speaking at UNIA meetings. Then, in 1948, Ken Hill moved a resolution in the KCC for the council to erect a suitable statue in Garvey's memory at a prominent place in the capital city. On November 4, 1956, thousands of Jamaicans gathered to witness the unveiling of Garvey's bronze bust done by the famous sculptor Alvin Marriott. Finally, in 1964, Edward Seaga, the then Minister of Development and Welfare, accepted the proposal from Leslie Alexander to bring Garvey's remains home for reinterment in Jamaica. On Sunday, November 15, 1964, an official service was held in the Holy Trinity Cathedral on North Street, attended by the Prime Minister, members of the Cabinet and the Jamaican Parliament, as well as representatives from the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malta, and Malaysia. The coffin bearing his remains was then taken to National Heroes Park, where some 30,000 Jamaicans witnessed the reinterment ceremony. He was then declared Jamaica's first national hero. Marcus Mosiah Garvey had finally come in from the cold.
The legacy. Marcus Garvey, more so than any other individual, placed Africans and people of African descent in the consciousness of the modern world, and in such a manner that they could never be removed again. C.L.R. James. Marcus Garvey was the first man on a mass scale and level to give millions of Negroes a sense of dignity and destiny. Martin Luther King. Every time you see another nation on the African continent become independent, you know that Marcus Garvey is alive. Malcolm X. Liberty Hall, located at 76 King Street, which was the center of activities for the UNIA, was purchased by the government of Jamaica in 1987 for the people of Jamaica. The restored Kingston Liberty Hall was reopened to the public in October 2003 and now serves as a museum of the life and work of the Right Excellent Marcus Mosiah Garvey.
Marcus Garvey words come to pass. Marcus Garvey words come to pass. Can't get no food to eat. Can't get no money to spend. Oh, can't get no food to eat. Can't get no money to spend. Come, little one, oh, let me do what I can for you. And you, hello. Come, little one, come.